A judge fined him for wearing a cross in court. What she didn't know? He just passed the bar with the highest score in the state. You ever seen somebody walk into a room and everything changes? Not because they said a word, but because of how they carry themselves. Quiet, sharp, unbothered. That was Jamal Everett. It was a Wednesday morning in Macon, Georgia. Heat already dancing off the pavement. Courtroom 2B smelled like coffee and stress. Most folks there were regulars, public defenders, court reporters, bailiffs who knew each other's lunch orders. But when Jamal walked in, heads turned. Not because he made noise. He didn't. It was the way he moved. Calm, confident, wearing a tailored navy blue suit and a small gold cross that sat just below his tie. He wasn't there to show off. That cross? It had belonged to his grandmother. She wore it every day, even when the chemo made it hard for her to breathe. She told him once, "Baby, no matter how far you go, take a piece of home with you." That cross was his piece of home. Jamal had just passed the bar with top scores in the state. But in this courtroom, on this day, he was acting as a clerk, helping draft motions, carrying files, learning the ropes before taking on full cases. Just another day of quiet hustle. Until it wasn't. Presiding over the hearing was Judge Carol Whitman. 62, sharp tongue, iron straight posture, no nonsense. People respected her, feared her even, but they didn't always trust her. She had a reputation for keeping her courtroom clean. No chewing gum, no phones, no sunglasses, no distractions, as she called it. So when she looked up and saw Jamal's cross glint under the overhead light, she paused. "Sir," she said, her voice slicing through the room, "remove that necklace." Jamal looked around, confused for a second, thought she might be talking to someone else. She wasn't. "This is a courtroom, not a church," she said. "Religious symbols have no place here." Jamal stayed respectful. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I believe I'm within my rights to wear this." She didn't flinch. "You're not. Remove it or face contempt." Gasps floated up from the back row. Someone dropped a pen. Even the bailiff looked unsure. Jamal didn't move. "Your Honor, there's no rule prohibiting this. And under the First Amendment," she cut him off. "That's enough. Contempt of court. $200 fine. And I suggest you brush up on courtroom etiquette." Jamal's jaw stayed still. He didn't argue, didn't flinch, just nodded once and sat down. But something in the room had shifted. People felt it. They didn't know what was coming next, but it wasn't going to be quiet. But Jamal wasn't the kind of man who let things slide, not when they mattered. Nobody said a word for the next 5 minutes. Judge Whitman kept the docket moving like nothing happened. Case after case, name after name. But the energy in the room was different. You could feel it, like a window had cracked, and the air was leaking out. Jamal sat quietly in the corner near the plaintiff's table, hands folded, that same gold cross still hanging just below his tie. He wasn't wearing it to be rebellious. He wasn't trying to prove a point, but now it was a point, one that had just cost him $200 and a slap of public humiliation. His supervisor, a soft-spoken attorney named Rhonda James, leaned over and whispered, "You okay?" He nodded slightly, still calm, but his eyes didn't move from the judge. "She's dead wrong," he said softly, "and she knows it." Rhonda glanced nervously toward the bench. "Just don't poke the bear." But the bear was already awake. After court recessed for lunch, Jamal gathered the files and followed Rhonda out into the hallway. As they passed a group of clerks by the vending machines, he heard someone mutter, under their breath, "Should have just taken it off." He stopped, turned slightly. "Excuse me?" A younger clerk, maybe 23, tried to wave it off. "I mean, you could have avoided all this, man. Just take it off for an hour and be done with it." Jamal gave a small, tight smile. "If I have to hide my faith just to be treated with respect in a government building, then the problem isn't the necklace." The hallway went quiet again, but not everyone was judging him. A bailiff named Thomas Ray, old school, former Marine, pulled him aside near the elevator. "I've worked this court 20 years, he said. "Never seen her pull that on anyone else, not once. You keep your head, son. Folks are watching." Jamal nodded. Good. Because he was already writing the appeal in his head. Every clause, every precedent. The judge thought she was teaching a lesson, but she'd just walked into one. Later that afternoon, Jamal sat at a corner desk in the legal office 2 blocks from the courthouse. His laptop was open. His fingers were moving fast. Whitman versus Public Expression 2024. Contempt fine issued without legal basis. No established court rule. First Amendment protections upheld in Tinker v. Des Moines, Chandler v. McMinn, State of Georgia v. Petrovich. Rhonda peeked over his shoulder. You're filing a grievance? Not just that. I'm writing a memorandum for public record. She sighed. You really want that smoke? He stopped typing. I didn't come this far to be silent. Not for a judge. Not for anybody. That night, the office printer ran hot as pages stacked into a neat folder. The cross? Still around his neck. But now it meant something new. It wasn't just memory, it was resistance. Quiet, respectful, and unshakable. By Friday morning, the grievance had landed on the desk of the Georgia Judicial Review Board. By Saturday, someone had leaked the memo to a civil rights blog. By Sunday, Twitter had picked it up. People were talking. Lawyers, journalists, past defendants, former clerks, all with stories. She always had it out for anyone who didn't play by her decorum rules. I got kicked out for wearing a head wrap. She once fined a man for saying amen after being acquitted. The mask was cracking, and Judge Whitman didn't even know it yet. But Jamal knew. He'd seen this play before, and this time, he was writing the ending. Long before Jamal Everett ever stepped foot in a courtroom, he sat at a folding table in the back room of Greater Mount Hope Baptist Church in Savannah, Georgia. His grandmother, Miss Geraldine, had a voice like gravel and gold. She was the kind of woman who could scold you and pray for you in the same breath. She raised Jamal after his mom passed, gave him food, discipline, and fire. And every Sunday morning, without fail, she pinned that gold cross around her neck and told him, "Baby, if you don't stand for something, you'll kneel for anything." That cross stayed with her through hospital visits, chemo rounds, and silent nights when Jamal sat beside her bed, holding her hand while trying to study for midterms. When she passed, he didn't cry at the funeral, not until the preacher handed him that necklace. He wore it to every interview, every class presentation, every job he ever wanted, and got. Not for superstition, for grounding. So when Judge Whitman said take it off, it wasn't just about jewelry. It was about who gets to decide what dignity looks like. But what about her? Carol Whitman wasn't born with power. She clawed her way to the bench in a field dominated by men who rolled their eyes when she spoke. She fought through her own storms, lost a husband, raised 2 kids, and got a law degree, working night shifts and living off gas station coffee. Somewhere along the way, she started believing respect had to be earned in her courtroom with silence and obedience. Not with faith, not with culture, not with protest. She didn't hate Jamal. She didn't even know him. But when she saw that cross, something inside her snapped, something she'd never admit. Because deep down, she remembered a courtroom in Charleston 20 years ago when she'd been laughed out of a motion hearing by a male judge who told her to smile more. She remembered how small she felt, how invisible. And now, on that bench, she never wanted to feel that way again. So she made others feel it first. But power without reflection? That's a dangerous thing. And Jamal? He wasn't some random clerk in a tie. He was a rising star at Benson & Clay, one of the top civil rights firms in the Southeast. He had already been invited to speak at law schools in New Orleans and Tallahassee. His bar score had shocked professors. People were watching him before this even happened. Now they were listening. Because this wasn't just about a necklace. It was about what happens when someone who's done everything right gets punished just for being himself. And the world loves a man who fights back with grace and facts instead of shouting. By Monday morning, the phones at the Magnolia County Courthouse were ringing off the hook. Clerks tried to act normal, but they were nervous. Calls from local reporters, emails from national outlets. One clerk leaned over to another and whispered, "He's trending." The other shook her head. "Lord, this ain't good." At Benson & Clay, Jamal walked in like it was any other morning, but the conference room was already buzzing. A paralegal handed him a printout. The blog post had hit over 250,000 views overnight. Headlines were all over his face. Georgia judge fines legal clerk for wearing religious necklace. Experts call it unconstitutional. Crossfire in the courtroom. Harassment or protocol. Young black lawyer pushes back on power. He hadn't even posted the memo himself. Someone else had forwarded it to a journalist. Now he was the center of a conversation he didn't ask for, but wasn't running from either. Rhonda closed the door behind her. You ready for this? Jamal looked up from his notes. I didn't start it, but I'm not backing off either. She nodded. Good, because it's growing fast. By noon, civil rights attorneys from Baltimore, Miami, and Los Angeles were tweeting in support. A law professor from UCLA had written a full breakdown of the legal errors in Judge Whitman's decision. Even a retired Supreme Court clerk chimed in on Reddit. Then came the radio shows, podcasts, news segments. The cross had become a symbol, not just of Jamal's faith, but of a bigger question. Who gets to define professionalism in spaces that were never designed for everyone to belong? At home that night, Jamal sat on his couch with the lights low, phone buzzing non-stop. He scrolled through messages. One said, I wore a hijab to jury duty and got pulled into a separate room for clarification. Thank you for standing up. Another, my grandfather wore a yarmulke to traffic court. The judge wouldn't even look at him. One message stood out. No name, just 2 lines. I saw what she did to you. She did something similar to me back in 2019, but I didn't know how to fight back. The next morning, Jamal was sipping coffee when Rhonda called him. She responded, she said flatly. Who? Jamal asked, already knowing the answer. Whitman, through a statement, says your behavior was disruptive and that court decorum must be preserved at all times, claims she's faced threats and misrepresentation. Jamal didn't respond right away. He stared out the window, sunlight flashing off his watch. Let them talk, he finally said. I'm filing the formal brief today. Across town, Judge Whitman sat alone in her chambers. The usual confidence in her posture had dipped just slightly, a framed picture of her kids on her desk, a legal pad full of scribbled notes in front of her. She wasn't used to this kind of attention. She clicked her pen over and over. A court liaison entered quietly. Judge, the circuit administrator wants to schedule a meeting. They want to discuss your recent courtroom conduct. She didn't answer, just looked out the window for a long time. Later that afternoon, Jamal walked into the same courthouse with that same gold cross tucked just under his tie. Not to provoke, just to finish what he started. People watched him like they were expecting something big to happen. And maybe they were right. He walked into a closed-door meeting with his attorney, a representative from the state bar, and a constitutional expert from Georgia State. He handed them his memorandum, calm, clean, precise. It wasn't full of emotion. It didn't have to be. The law was already on his side. And outside the courthouse, a small crowd had gathered. Not angry, not loud, just present. Supporters, students, church elders, even a few quiet critics who came to listen, not shout. Because what started as a fine had now become a mirror, and everybody was seeing something different in the reflection. By Wednesday morning, Courtroom 2B wasn't just a place for motions and minor hearings. It was the center of a statewide storm. Outside, TV vans lined the street. Inside, Judge Carol Whitman sat behind the bench, her usual expression of iron restraint replaced by something looser. Tired eyes, jaw clenched, fingers twitching on her gavel. She knew the room was different today, not just packed, charged. Jamal entered with Rhonda beside him. His steps were slow, deliberate. He didn't look around, didn't need to. He could feel it. All eyes. Not on the cross, on him. A representative from the Georgia Judicial Conduct Board was present, sitting just feet from the bench. The meeting wasn't formal, but it was heavy. They were observing court conduct and reviewing Jamal's grievance in real time. Judge Whitman tried to carry on with the schedule like nothing had changed, but her voice wavered. At one point, she paused mid-sentence, took a breath, looked straight at Jamal. Mr. Everett, she said, dry and official, do you have anything you wish to state for the record regarding your prior conduct in this court? Jamal stood up slowly, adjusted his tie, and said in a steady voice, Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to clarify that my conduct has never been disruptive. I've always complied with this court's procedures, and I wore a religious symbol that does not violate any written rule, nor any constitutional guideline. The room stayed silent. Whitman leaned forward. You felt targeted? He didn't blink. I was. She didn't argue, didn't bark back, not this time. After a court recessed, she retreated to her chambers without a word. Hours later, the board convened a private session. Jamal and Rhonda were invited in. The head investigator, a sharp-eyed woman named Dolores King, spoke first. "Mr. Everett, we've reviewed your filing. We've interviewed courthouse staff. We've examined the pattern of conduct in Judge Whitman's courtroom, and what we found raised serious concerns." Rhonda stayed quiet. Dolores continued, "You're not the first to experience this type of selective enforcement under her authority, but you're the first who put it in writing, and put your name on it." Jamal didn't smile, just nodded. Later that week, the findings were released to the public. The board issued a formal rebuke to Judge Whitman, citing inconsistent application of courtroom rules, bias in enforcement, and behavior inconsistent with judicial impartiality. She wasn't removed, but she was placed under supervision, forced to undergo judicial ethics training, and the contempt fine dropped, expunged. That Friday, Jamal sat on a folding chair in the basement of Greater Mount Hope during a youth mentoring event. Kids asked him questions about law school, about what it's like to go up against a judge. He leaned forward and said, "You don't have to be loud to be heard. You don't have to yell to be right. Sometimes, just standing still is enough to shake the ground." Someone in the back shouted, "Say that again!" He laughed, holding the chain around his neck. But across town, Judge Whitman sat alone in her office. Her once proud name now whispered behind closed doors. She stared at the memo Jamal had submitted, read it for the 5th time. It was brilliant. Not just legally, but personally. It was respectful, professional, sharp, fair. And deep down, she knew this young man, the one she tried to silence, he didn't just win the argument, he won her attention. She closed the file, looked out at the cloudy sky through her narrow office window, and whispered to herself, "I was wrong." But apologies don't erase actions. They just give them a place to rest. 2 weeks later, Jamal stood on the steps of Savannah State University, invited to speak at a campus-wide forum on justice and personal conviction. The auditorium had been packed, but it was after the talk, on those concrete steps under a gray sky, that people really leaned in. A freshman walked up and said, "Man, I thought I had to change who I am to fit into law school. Now I think maybe the system needs to fit us too." Jamal smiled. "Don't let anybody make you shrink to make them comfortable. Not in a courtroom. Not in life." That line ended up all over social media. A clip of him saying it hit 1 million views by the next day. But Jamal wasn't chasing fame. He was just telling the truth. Back at the courthouse, change was slow, but visible. A new poster went up in the hallway. Respect includes culture, belief, and presence. Judge Whitman didn't attend the ceremony when it was installed, but she signed off on it. Later, she called Rhonda James personally and asked for Jamal's number. Rhonda hesitated, then passed it along. The next day, Jamal got a short voicemail. "Mr. Everett, this is Judge Carol Whitman. I owe you a direct apology. I misjudged you. I misapplied the law, and I see that now. I hope one day we can speak. That's all." He didn't call her back, not out of spite, but because some lessons don't need a conversation, they just need to be remembered. Instead, he focused on what came next. Jamal started teaching part-time at a local high school on the weekends. Civics, law, self-respect. He told his students, the law is only as fair as the people brave enough to question it. And every time someone asked about the necklace, he'd say, it's not about religion, it's about memory. It's about not letting people rewrite who you are just because they're uncomfortable with the parts that shine." The kids got it. One student raised her hand and said, "So it's like fighting back without fighting ugly?" He laughed. "Exactly." The cross stayed on his chest, not as a weapon, not as a statement, just as a piece of truth that never needed permission. In the end, the fine disappeared, but the impact stayed. Jamal hadn't just defended himself. He'd forced an institution to check itself, and did it with calm, class, and precision, not through anger, through clarity. Because sometimes strength doesn't come from how loud you get. It comes from how still you stand when everything tries to knock you off center. If this story moved you, share it. If it made you think, talk about it. And if it reminded you of who you are, don't hide it. Because the world doesn't need more silence. It needs more people who wear their truth with pride, no matter who's watching.